My brother dropped his 9-year-old daughter off at my apartment with one duffel bag and a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, like he was relieved to be rid of her. He didn't ring the doorbell. He knocked twice, fast, and when I opened the door, he was already stepping back toward the elevator, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket like he had somewhere more important to be. His wife Lacey was waiting in the car downstairs. I could see her through the lobby window, sunglasses on, engine running, not even looking up at the building. "Hey," I said, "what's going on? I thought you were in Nashville this week." Change of plans. My brother Reed smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nudged the duffel bag toward my feet with the toe of his shoe. "Lacey and I have a work thing out in Scottsdale. 3, maybe 4 days. Just need you to hold on to Penny for a bit." Penny stood behind him, one hand wrapped around the strap of her backpack, the other clutching a small stuffed rabbit against her chest. The rabbit was old, its gray fur worn smooth in patches from years of being held. I'd seen her carry it before, but never like this. Both arms locked tight around it, knuckles white, jaw set the way a kid's jaw sets when they're working very hard not to let their face give anything away. I looked at my brother. "You couldn't have called first?" "I have deadlines this week, Reed." "You'll be fine," he said, already moving. "She's easy. She won't bother you." He said it like she wasn't standing right there. Like she wasn't 9 years old, watching him walk away with those enormous, careful eyes. He didn't hug her. Didn't tell her he'd miss her. Didn't say he'd call. He just raised one hand over his shoulder as he stepped into the elevator. A casual half-wave, the kind you'd give an acquaintance on the street. And then the doors slid shut, and he was gone. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure what had just happened. Then I looked down at Penny. She wasn't crying. She wasn't upset, not in any way I could easily name. She just looked at me with this expression I can only describe as deliberately blank, like a child who had learned somewhere along the way that showing too much on her face wasn't safe. "Hey, Bug," I said, stepping back to let her in. "You hungry?" She shook her head. "Want to sit down?" She nodded. I moved her bag inside, closed the door, and she followed me to the couch and sat without taking off her backpack or setting down the rabbit. Just perched there, straight-backed, like she was waiting for something she'd been rehearsing for. "Penny," I kept my voice even, "are you okay?" She looked at me for a long moment, then very quietly, "They're not going to Scottsdale." Something shifted in my chest. "What do you mean?" "They're going to meet someone about Mom's house," she said. "A buyer. I heard them on the phone 3 weeks ago." They thought I was asleep. She pressed the rabbit tighter against her ribs. "Sloan, Mom's house is supposed to be mine." My name is Sloan. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years running a freelance graphic design business out of a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. My life is not dramatic. I handle logo projects, brand identity packages, and the occasional difficult client who wants a rebrand in 48 hours. That's about as eventful as things get for me. Until that Tuesday morning, I would have told you my brother Reed was basically a decent person. Self-absorbed, sure. Checked out since the remarriage, definitely. But not someone I needed to be afraid of. Not someone I needed to watch. I was wrong. You need to understand who Penny is before any of this makes sense. Reed's first wife, Christine, passed away almost 3 years ago from a rare autoimmune disease. She was 34. Penny was 6. Christine and Reed had been together since high school, and even as their marriage started fracturing in that final year, the strain of illness does that, quietly, to a lot of couples. Christine had been a fiercely devoted mother. She'd spent the last months of her life getting her affairs in order with a clarity that I didn't fully appreciate until that Tuesday on my couch. Christine had set up an irrevocable trust for Penny, the house they'd lived in together. A 3-bedroom Craftsman in East Nashville that Christine had inherited from her own mother was placed into that trust. The property was valued somewhere around $400,000. The terms were specific. The house was to remain available for Penny's housing and benefit until she turned 21, at which point full ownership would transfer to her outright. Reed had been named trustee, which Christine's estate attorney had agreed to as a practical matter at the time. That attorney, a woman named Ms. Doyle, had drawn up the documents and was designated as independent oversight counsel, separate from Reed, a check and balance Christine had insisted on. Reed had remarried 14 months after Christine died. He and Lacey moved into a condo in Columbus. The Nashville house had been rented out, the rental income flowing into the trust. I hadn't thought hard about any of the details until Penny sat on my couch with her rabbit and told me her father was meeting with a buyer. "Tell me everything," I said. I sat down next to her and didn't soften my voice the way adults do sometimes with kids when they're not really listening. I just talked to her straight. Don't leave anything out. She told me everything she'd overheard that night 3 weeks ago, standing in the hallway while they thought she was asleep. She'd heard Reed say the Nashville property. She'd heard Lacey say something about a cash offer above asking. She'd heard Reed say they needed to move fast before anyone raised questions, and she'd heard Lacey respond with something that made Penny's stomach drop. "We just need the conservatorship order and we're done." She hadn't understood all of it, but she understood enough. She understood it was about her mother's house, and that they were trying to get it, and that she wasn't supposed to know. "I looked up conservatorship on my tablet," Penny said. "It means someone gets to take over making decisions about property. If a judge signs a conservatorship order for my trust, my dad can do whatever he wants with the house. Sell it, keep the money." She paused. "She said the hearing is already scheduled." I wrote the date down. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was small and precise. A date, a time, the words Davidson County Probate Court. The hearing was in 68 hours. I stared at that paper for a long moment. Then I looked up at Penny, at this 9-year-old child who had quietly taught herself the legal vocabulary to understand what was being done to her, who had written down the date the moment she heard it because she was scared she'd forget, who had carried this alone for 3 weeks without telling a single adult because she was smart enough to know that the adults around her couldn't be trusted. "There's one more thing," she said. She looked down at the rabbit. Slowly, carefully, she turned it over and pulled apart a seam along the back. A seam that had been stitched more recently than the rest. Tight and deliberate, different thread. From inside the stuffing, she withdrew a small white envelope, folded once. On the front, in handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas notes for years. "For Penny to give to Sloan if something ever feels wrong." My hands were trembling when I took it. I won't quote the whole letter. Parts of it feel too private, too specifically meant for the two of us, and no one else. But the parts that mattered. Christine had known, even in those final months, that she couldn't fully trust what would happen after she was gone. She'd structured the trust to be as airtight as she and Ms. Doyle could make it. She had specifically named Ms. Doyle as independent counsel for that reason, and she had written down Ms. Doyle's direct phone number, underlined once. She had also written, "If Reed ever tries to sell the house, or if you're being kept somewhere away from home while decisions are being made, find Sloan. She'll know what to do. She's always been the one who actually shows up." I had to put the letter down for a moment. I pressed both hands flat on the coffee table and breathed and did not let myself come apart in front of this child, who had already seen enough adults fall apart around her. Then I picked up my phone. Ms. Doyle answered on the second ring. I told her who I was, explained the situation as fast and clearly as I could, and read her the date and time from Penny's notebook paper. There was a brief weighted silence on the other end of the line. "I was not notified of any hearing," she said. Her voice was very measured. "As independent trust counsel, I am required to receive formal notice. That notice did not come to my office." He cut you out. It appears so. A pause. Mr. Sloan, I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I tell you. We have a narrow window, but we have one. Can you do that? I said yes. What she explained over the next 20 minutes was staggering. Reed had apparently been filing procedural motions quietly over the past year and a half. Not dramatic filings, nothing that would raise flags. Just incremental paperwork designed to consolidate his control over the trust administration. The conservatorship petition was the endgame. It would effectively override the original trust terms, giving Reed unilateral authority to liquidate the property under a legal justification about managing trust assets for the minor's benefit. It was a genuine loophole that judges sometimes approved without close scrutiny when no one showed up to contest it. Reed had been counting on an empty courtroom. Ms. Doyle told me she would file an emergency notice of appearance that evening and object to the hearing proceeding without proper notification to trust counsel. She would file a motion challenging the procedural validity of the entire petition. She needed us there in person. Me as Penny's adult next of kin advocate, and Penny because her presence would make visually, immediately clear to any judge that this was a real child with a real stake in what was being decided. The one thing you cannot do, Ms. Doyle said, is let your brother know you're coming. If he realizes you're aware of the hearing, he can file for emergency continuance, buy himself more time, find another angle. He has to walk into that courtroom thinking it's empty. So I played the part. Reed texted me that evening, "How's Penny, behaving herself?" I typed back, "She's great. We made pasta and watched a movie. She's already asleep." And then, because I needed him relaxed and unsuspecting, I added, "Have fun out there. Don't worry about her." He sent back a single thumbs-up emoji. That was it. A thumbs-up emoji for his 9-year-old daughter. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while just breathing. Penny and I worked at the kitchen table until almost midnight. Ms. Doyle had asked us to compile everything we had. Dates, overheard conversations, Christine's letter, the notebook paper with the hearing information. Penny was precise and methodical in a way that would have broken my heart if I'd let myself stop and think about what it meant that a 9-year-old had these skills. She wrote down every conversation she could remember, every name, every date. Her handwriting was small and neat, and she didn't complain or ask to stop. Around 10:30, she looked up at me and said, "Do you think it'll actually work?" "I think we're doing everything we can," I said. "And Ms. Doyle's been doing this for a very long time." Penny thought about that. "Mom always said you were the only person in the family who did things instead of just talking about them." I had to look away for a second. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed running through every scenario. Reed arriving early and somehow getting the hearing moved, the judge not taking the procedural argument seriously, Ms. Doyle's motion being denied on a technicality. I made myself work through each one, backwards, asking what we'd do. It helped the way making a list helps when your brain won't stop spinning. Not enough, but some. The morning of the hearing, I dressed deliberately. Nothing dramatic. Dark slacks, a gray blazer, the kind of outfit that signals competence without trying too hard. I helped Penny pick something out, too. She chose a navy dress her mother had bought her 2 winters ago that still fit. She put it on without a word, and stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for a moment, with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You look great," I said. "I know," she said, and then, very small, "I want to look like I'm supposed to be there." "You are supposed to be there," I said, "more than anyone else in that room." We didn't talk much on the drive down. Penny sat in the back seat with the rabbit in her lap, watching the highway slide past the windows. About 20 minutes out, she said, "What if he gets really angry?" "He probably will," I said. "That's not your problem to manage." She was quiet then. "You didn't have to do this. It's not your problem either." I looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes, it is," I said. "It's been my problem since your mom wrote my name on that envelope." Ms. Doyle was waiting at the courthouse entrance. A small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back and a leather briefcase worn at the corners in a way that said she had carried it into a great many rooms where things mattered. She shook my hand firmly, then crouched down to Penny's eye level. "You must be Penny," she said. "Your mother spoke about you every single time I talked to her. Every single time." Penny studied her carefully. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough to know she was one of the most prepared people I've ever had the privilege of working with," Ms. Doyle said. "She planned for everything, including today." We went in. Reed and Lacey were already seated at the respondents' table. Reed in a navy suit I'd never seen before, Lacey in a cream blazer, both of them leaning in close to their attorney in quiet conversation. They had the posture of people who had already won. Loose shoulders, unhurried gestures. Lacey had her phone out under the edge of the table. Reed looked up first. He stared for a full 2 or 3 seconds, clearly not processing what he was seeing. His face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like rapid internal calculation, and then something harder underneath all of it. A coldness that I'd never seen from him before, and hope I never have to see again. Lacey followed his gaze. Her hand tightened on her phone. Reed pushed back his chair and stood, Sloan, very controlled. "You need to take Penny home right now. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns Penny," I said, "which makes it my concern." "You don't understand what this proceeding is about." "I understand precisely what it's about," I said. "So does Miss Doyle." Miss Doyle stepped forward and introduced herself to the room with the calm authority of someone who has stood in exactly this kind of moment 100 times and knows exactly how it ends. Reed's attorney leaned over and began saying something fast and urgent into Reed's ear. Reed had gone slightly gray. The judge entered and called the room to order. What followed over the next 2 hours was not a dramatic courtroom confrontation, though it came close at the edges. It was more methodical than that. Ms. Doyle presented Christine's original trust documents, which contained explicit language restricting any sale or transfer of the property without approval from independent trust counsel. Approval that had never been requested, because Reed had never told Ms. Doyle he was pursuing a conservatorship. She presented documentation showing that formal hearing notice had not been transmitted to her office, a procedural violation that alone was sufficient to void the petition. She presented a 7-month timeline of communications between Reed and a Nashville real estate firm, 2 months of which predated his filing. She presented the forensic signatures on trust amendment attempts that had not been authorized. And then she submitted Christine's letter. She read the relevant sections aloud, without drama or editorializing. Christine's voice in that letter was clear and precise and completely without sentimentality. It was the voice of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why, and who had done it anyway, calmly, with time running out. The room was very quiet while Ms. Doyle read. Reed's attorney argued that the letter was personal correspondence with no legal standing. Ms. Doyle responded that it corroborated the intent of the trust documents and demonstrated that the decedent had specifically anticipated and sought to prevent this precise type of action. The judge listened to both sides without expression. Then he looked at Penny, who was sitting straight in her chair beside me, hands folded in her lap, rabbit tucked under the seat. "Young lady," the judge said, "do you understand what's being decided here today?" Penny looked up at him. "Yes, sir. It's about my mom's house. She left it for me." The judge nodded. Then he looked at Reed for a long moment without saying anything. Lacey had stopped, looking at her phone. He denied the conservatorship petition. He cited the procedural violations and what he called a pattern of conduct inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility, and he ordered a forensic audit of the trust accounts going back to the beginning of Reed's tenure. He froze all transactions related to the Nashville property immediately and voided any preliminary agreements with outside parties. Ms. Doyle told me afterward that the audit order was significant. It meant the judge suspected there was more to find than what we'd presented that day. What I hadn't anticipated was what happened next. Reed's attorney began distancing himself in real time, right there in the courtroom, from the specifics of the conservatorship filing. He started using phrases like "my client's understanding was," and "I was not made aware of all the underlying facts," which is attorney language for self-preservation. Reed started arguing with him, voice rising, and the bailiff raised a hand, and the room went taut and still. Lacey said nothing. She sat completely motionless and stared at the table in front of her. When we walked out of the courthouse, Reed was still inside. The sky was flat gray, the kind of Ohio October sky that seems to go on in every direction without edges, and Penny and I stood on the courthouse steps while Ms. Doyle made calls. The real estate firm, she told me, had already received a court communication that morning and had pulled out of the deal within the hour. The forensic audit would take time, but the property was frozen and protected. Nobody was selling anything. Penny reached up and took my hand without saying a word. I held on to it and didn't say anything either. The months after were not simple. Legal proceedings don't resolve cleanly. They stretch and stall and require follow-up and patience. Ms. Doyle had warned me, and she was right. The forensic audit took 4 months to complete. During that time, Reed and Lacey's lives unraveled in the quiet, grinding way that real legal trouble unravels things. Frozen accounts, professional fallout. The slow withdrawal of people who don't want to be associated with a situation that has court dates attached to it. The audit found nearly $60,000 in redirected rental income over 2.5 years, along with several smaller irregularities that added up. The investigation was ongoing the last time I checked, and I stopped checking because I had other things to pay attention to. I filed for temporary guardianship of Penny within the week after the hearing. The court granted it and made it permanent after the audit concluded, and the trust was formally restructured under a neutral corporate trustee. The same arrangement the judge in the original video had ordered, and for good reason. Every dollar of that trust was now accounted for, secured, and untouchable until Penny turned 21. Penny started at a new school in Columbus in January. The first week she was quiet at breakfast, careful with her answers, watching everything the way she always does. By the end of the second week, she came home and told me about a girl in her class named Britt, who had the same brand of sneakers and thought that was a good sign. By March, she was staying late for the school reading club on Thursday afternoons, and by April, she had opinions about which route home was better, and could I please not take the one past the construction. The stuffed rabbit lives on her windowsill now. She doesn't carry it everywhere anymore. I think that means she feels safe enough to put it down, and I think that's the whole point. I moved her into the larger bedroom and took the smaller one myself. She asked me 3 times if I was sure, and I told her I'd been meaning to reorganize that room anyway. It's not true, but it made her laugh a little, which I will take every single time. Some mornings I make breakfast before she's up, and I hear her alarm and her feet on the floor, and I think about Christine. About a woman who spent the last months of her life thinking through every possible failure point and trying to build protection around her daughter against each one, who sewed a letter into a stuffed rabbit, who wrote my name down and trusted that I would be worth the trust. I did not take an easy road here. I chose a child who wasn't mine over a version of family loyalty that had stopped deserving the name a long time ago. I would make that choice again without hesitating for a single second. But I want to ask you something, because I've been sitting with this question for months now. If you discovered that someone close to you, someone you grew up with, someone you still talk to at the holidays, was quietly stealing a future that belonged to a child, would you have done what I did? Or would you have convinced yourself it wasn't your place, That it was complicated. That maybe you were missing something? I used to think those were understandable answers. I don't anymore. Some things are very simple once you stop making them complicated. A child needed someone to show up, and showing up was the only thing that mattered. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. I really want to know.